So this is our last reading class. So if you guys have any questions pertaining to the reading test, today, like now is your chance to get them answered.
Wait, how many classes do we have left?
Three?
What?
I think three.
Can we do like
Same time, so bad.
We're doing
Can
reading
we have
today.
a vote?
No, that's not how it works.
Yeah. It's called the democracy.
No.
Yes.
I teach what Manoj put on the schedule for me to teach. Today is reading. We have some stuff to get through.
But we are a democracy, so we should have a vote.
You're a democracy. How is this a
It's
democracy?
we accidentally made it.
Our country is, so that means that, yeah, so that means everything in the country must be democracy.
That's not really how it works.
Yeah, it does. So passage 9 English, passage 9, or test 9 English,
What about test nine English?
that's what we're doing, right?
No.
Yeah.
See what Ryan Mick said back.
Or you can leave it on red.
Does he start trying to?
Yeah.
What?
How geometry go?
Geometry, it's like proofs kind of suck.
I
Not
know.
even gonna lie to you.
What was another thing that you were talking about at Athanasian?
Yes.
Yeah, I was like,
Just
yeah,
like,
that was
small.
I hate triangle proofs with the burning passion.
I like SSS, SSS.
I don't know what that is.
same side.
but
We're
I'm
gonna
interested.
get to it pretty soon.
It's not, it's, I mean, like the first 2 years it's really hard, but after
Hey, L was bored.
it's easy.
Imagine taking L.
Okay, so with reading, it's been a while since we worked on it, so we're gonna, some of this stuff is gonna be a little bit of a review, and then we'll kind of get into some ways to go about answering questions, so that'll be a little bit new. But again, most of this should just be kind of a refresher, just because it has been a while. So, number one, do passages in order of ease, like we talked about. I would say, since we're getting closer to the test, probably by today or like this next week, you want to have solidified what order you are going to do your tests or your passages in. Is anybody like completely confused? They have no idea what they want to do for that?
I have a question. What do you
Yes.
mean by getting closer to the test?
Like the test date
Of
is
what?
coming up.
Like the
December
ACT that you're gonna
ACT?
take is in December.
Oh.
We're getting closer to that,
How do you know? if you're
especially
trying
because there's only 3 classes left after
Yeah.
this. So
if you haven't-
getting down to the wire, we don't have a lot
if
of
you haven't-
chances left
Wait,
to.
how many times
do
is there an
this.
ACT, like, does ACT hold like the test a year?
I don't know. They do it typically every like 2 months, but then sometimes in the summer, if there's more demand for it, they'll do it more often. Just kind of depends on what the demand is and if people are wanting it. So, like I said, make sure that you have your order solidified probably within this next week, just so that you know what you're going to be doing. Yes.
How do you, how do you get your order if you don't know the passage?
Oh, like
Yeah.
that, like
So you base it off of like the general like style of passage. So instead of like just going in and then looking at what the passages are like more specifically, you want to have it decided before. So like prose fiction, social science, humanities, and natural science is going to be something that fits under those categories. And so you can choose from those categories which ones you want to do, or like what order you want to do them in. So you don't necessarily have to go in order that the test puts them in. So, if you guys are kind of struggling to choose your order, think about what things interest you. So humanities is like the arts. So it could be about like photography, could be about like actual art, could be about music. if you like that type of thing.
It's the worst.
You don't like that? Okay, did you do that one last then?
Yeah.
Okay, so I did that one first because I really like that. He does not like that, so he does it last. So again, if we were to do them in the order that they give them, I would be stuck on probably social science because I absolutely hate anything that has to do with history. So I always did that one last because then the thought process there is that if you're doing the ones that you find to be either the easiest or the most interesting first, then number one, you're going to get through them quicker, and then you'll have more time to spend on the one that you find to be the most difficult. And then number two, if you're more interested in them and you find them to be easier, then you're going to be answering the questions correctly.
But if you do the hardest one first, you get to the ones that you like. So you have like, so you want to do them faster, so you can get to the ones that you like.
Well, not necessarily, because a lot of times if you're doing one that you're not interested in, you're going to be spending more time on that. And then the issue is that you're not going to have enough time. A lot of times people spend way too much time on one of them, and then they don't have enough time to finish the test.
Yeah, so like if you like the passage, you'll spend more time reading it.
Not necessarily. If you are interested in the passage, you should be able to understand it better. So then when you answer the questions, you're not, like, you're able to answer them right away, and you're not going back to look at the passage to answer the questions.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
No,
No?
but okay.
Okay, so basically, if you do the ones that you find to be the easiest first, you're able to get through those quicker. You're also answering those questions correctly. So then you spend, like, let's say you get through those, and now you have 10 minutes left on your test. You can spend those 10 minutes just focusing on the passage that you find to be the most difficult, so you can spend more time making sure that those answers are being answered correctly. Does that make sense?
Champ, how does that not make sense?
You
I
still,
Yeah,
mean, I'm not
it
gonna
makes
force
sense.
you to do it in any specific order, but if you do them in your easiest order, that really helped me to do it like that. But if you wanna do something else, I can't force you to do that. So you can choose what you want. I'm just giving you options here, or telling you what has helped me and helped other people in the past, so. Take it or leave it, I guess. You don't have to take all of these things. And then the second one is to preheat your brain. That's kind of what they talk about in the ACT 36 book. That's kind of how they refer to it as, like, preheat your brain with the citation. So before the passage actually starts, they'll tell you, it'll give you a lot of times, like, the author, it'll tell you the name of, like, what this story is. Maybe it's taken out of a certain essay or something like that, and so they'll tell you what it's taken out of. And so sometimes it can help you have a little bit more context about what the passage is about, just so that because these are very different styles, it can kind of help you switch your brain over into that mode of thinking about a different style of passage. And then the third one, force yourself to be interested. So just make sure that you are paying attention while you're reading, actively reading. You're not, like, dozing off or anything.
What if you're not interested?
Fake it till you make it. Just trick your brain. Tell yourself that you are interested. Even if you find it to be the most boring thing ever. Say in your head, oh my gosh, I love this. This is amazing. Can't wait to read more about it. Even if you absolutely hate it. Just trick your brain into thinking that you like it. Gotta have a positive attitude about it. Yes?
I forget, is it English or reading where we're supposed to, like, read like an editor?
That's English. Because that's looking for more grammar things. This is just more being able to understand, like, the general overview of, like, what the passage is saying and what the author thinks. But I mean, reading like an editor wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing with the reading test, just as long as you're more focusing on the content rather than the grammar of it. Okay, so now we're going to get into a little bit of what you should do while you're actually going, while you're reading the passage. So again, this is something that we talked about. So while you're reading, indexing, making little notes in the margins, underlining, picking out what the important parts of the passage are, just so that when you go to answer the questions, you can go back and look at a specific section or paragraph instead of trying to search for the answer in the whole entire passage and having to reread the whole entire passage. Okay, and now we're gonna get into answering the questions. Okay, so now this is going through kind of different ways to answer the questions and then just a few more pointers for when you're actually answering the questions. So the first one is, when you read the question, you should have a good enough understanding of what the passage is saying that you should be able to answer the question already, like in your head, without looking at the answer choices. So if you understood the passage, you should be able just to read the question, think of the answer in your head, and then when you read the answer choices, see which one matches up with what you thought the answer was, and that most likely is going to be the correct answer. The next one is process of elimination. So that's basically just crossing off answers that you know are wrong. So some reasons why you want to get rid of them is if the answer is too broad, sometimes the answer is too specific, or sometimes it changes the relationship. And what I mean by that is basically sometimes it'll be like the answer is factually correct, but it just doesn't really make sense with what the question is asking. And so if you find that to be the case, just make sure that when you read the question, the answer that you choose logically makes sense. And so that kind of goes along with number 7, answer what the question is asking. So make sure that it logically follows with that, because sometimes they'll try to trick you and they'll give you an answer that is like an exact sentence or an exact phrase that you can find somewhere in the passage. And so then if you find it in the passage, you're like, oh, well that must be the correct answer because it said it in the passage. Well, not necessarily, because it doesn't, just because you found it in the passage doesn't mean that it is going to answer the question that it's asking. So just be aware of that. And then number 8, make sure that the passage supports the answer that you choose. All of the answers are going to be found somewhere in the passage. So sometimes the answer is going to be like explicitly stated in the passage. It'll just come out right and tell you what it is. Other times, it'll just allude to it, or you kind of have to infer it based off of what the author is saying. If there's questions like that, just pay attention to the language that the author is using. Pay attention to their word choice, because a lot of times they will, without explicitly telling you how they feel about a certain topic, they'll tell you how they feel about it based off of their word choice. A lot of times it'll kind of lead you to an answer, or make it clear what their opinion is, like whether they like it, or sometimes if they really don't like it at all, you can tell based off of the language that they're using that it's like, oh yeah, they don't really like this at all. And then the last one is just kind of timing, general rule of thumb. If you are 30 seconds in to answering a question, and you're not 30 seconds from the end of it, skip it and just come back.
Yeah, that's not 11, sorry.
Sorry for my terrible handwriting. I mean, you don't have to like be keeping track of the clock and paying attention to how much time you're spending, or like exactly how much time you're spending on each question. This is just kind of a general, if you find that you're spending too much time on one question, just skip it and come back. It's not worth it. So sometimes there'll just be a question that you find just really confusing, or you just read it and you're like, I don't get what this is saying, and then sitting there and rereading it 5 times trying to figure out what it's saying is not going to help you. You're just going to be wasting time when instead you could move on, answer the questions that you're actually able to answer. Then if you have time at the end, you can come back and use that extra time to spend on that specific question. I know for me, there was, not in the reading test, but in the science test, there were a couple questions where I just found myself wasting so much time because I was just sitting there rereading the question and I couldn't figure out what it was trying to ask. Well, instead of doing that, I should have just skipped it, answered the other questions, and then come back to it at the end, instead of wasting all my time on one question and then being rushed on the others. So the same thing applies to the reading test. Try not to spend more than a minute on a question, just because you don't have a lot of time, and when you have 10 questions per passage, you can't be spending 10 minutes answering the questions when you still have to read the passage too. So, okay, do you guys have any questions for me about the reading test in general? Anything that we have gone through, any of this that you guys are confused about? Okay, how do you guys feel about the reading test overall? You said that you don't feel too great about it? You don't like the reading test? Okay. Anybody else? You guys
I
feel
do not like it.
you don't like it?
No.
Okay, what do you guys feel is the biggest struggle for you? Like, why don't you like it?
I just
It's
hate
boring.
reading.
It's a
Okay, you just don't, yeah.
I just don't.
So a lot of times, a lot of people struggle with trying to get it done in time, and so then you feel that rush, and then if you're rushing through it, then like sometimes you make just like stupid mistakes. And it's hard to avoid that just because you can't be spending a ton of time on each passage, especially when you're trying to get them done in 8 minutes. If you're a little bit of a slower reader, sometimes that can be a little bit difficult to try to get done in time. One thing I would say to that, if you're feeling rushed, if you still have a lot left to do, well, not necessarily a lot left to do. When you're taking the test and the proctor announces that there's 5 minutes left, don't get all panicked, because especially in the reading test, like every second counts, every minute counts, so you can use those 5 minutes and answer a lot of questions. If you find that you're just maybe starting the last passage and they announce that there's 5 minutes left, well, okay, it's not ideal to only have 5 minutes to work on, or to have to do a whole entire passage. You could still scan the passage and try to answer some of those questions. So if you find that that's the case, just don't get too freaked out about it. Just know that those 5 minutes is going to seem like a long time. Like it'll be, not necessarily a long time, but it's a good amount of time to try to get stuff done. Like you still have time to get stuff done. Don't be too freaked out about it. especially if you're doing practice passages, practice tests, and you find that you're working up right until the last minute, just be aware that you are working up until the last minute, so that when they announce that there's 5 minutes left, you know, okay, well, when I'm doing practice tests, I seem to be getting done like 1 minute or 2 minutes early, so as long as I'm still keeping that same pace, I'm fine, you know, so just don't get super freaked out by that. Because at least I know for me, that can be a little bit scary, because it's like, oh my gosh, I have to finish, I have to just fill out all the answers. Well, no, you can have time to do other stuff, to actually think about answering them. You just said that you just don't really find reading to
I
be
just hate
fun,
reading.
just reading in general. Okay. So that's when you gotta use that positive mentality.
I tell
Just-
myself I like it.
Yeah, tell yourself that you like it. I had a friend one time who told me that she was working on the test. I think she was actually working on the math test, but she was like getting close to the end and she was getting super stressed out because she didn't think she was gonna finish. So she would just like smile. She would just like smile at the page because like apparently it's a psychology thing where if you're smiling, your brain thinks that you're happy. And so that kind of helps her. I've never done that, but
I will use that.
if
so
you
much.
find, yeah, it might be a little bit creepy, but I mean, you could look up some of those things like the psychology of, or like the psychology things that you could do, you know, trick your brain into thinking that you like something. I don't know what else there is.
Okay, I'll have to do that.
Yeah.
I would love it.
Just
if
start
you do it.
smiling at the
Just watch
page.
me.
Yeah, it might look a little bit weird, but
No, just
if it
watch
helps.
my test. You will see me just like, oh yes.
Yes.
So
just over and over in your head, just be like, yes, I am loving this. I'm having so much fun. Even if you're not, which I'm sure most of you do not find taking a, what is it, like a 4-hour test? I'm sure most people don't find a 4-hour test enjoyable. At least most people I know don't find taking a 4-hour test enjoyable. So, yeah. Do you guys have any questions about the ACT in general?
What are the sections for the reading again? What are the categories or?
Prose fiction, social science, like social studies, humanities, and then natural science.
Okay, they figure that out.
Yeah, so you could probably right now kind of think of like a general, well, I think I probably like these, so I'm gonna do them like the first two, or sometimes like you just look at them and you're like, oh, I know I absolutely hate this one, so I'm gonna do that one last. So you can kind of come up with a general idea. Is there any one particular type of passage that you guys find to be more difficult than the others? Or is it just more of you find one to be more interesting and so you find that to be, it's more like an interest thing?
I don't like the social science one. I don't like that one.
I don't either, so.
Is that
I would
history?
probably just recommend doing that
Yeah,
one
it's like
last.
history. Yeah, I hate that too. I hate all of them, but it's fine.
Oh, another thing is that if you, so you wanna have your order decided before you go to take the test. I would probably solidify that this week. When you go to take the test, if you think that you're gonna get confused when you're taking the test as to which order you're doing them in, one thing that I did was when the test started, so like they said that we could start the reading test, I would spend like the first 5 seconds and just at the top of the page, so like I would open up to prose fiction and whichever one, let's say I was gonna do that one second, I would write a 2 at the top. Then I'd move on to the next one, and social science, so I did that one last, so I'd put a 4 at the top. Humanities, put a number 1 at the top, and natural science, a number 3. So then, when I was flipping through, I would know exactly where I was going to be going next, instead of trying to figure it out, just because sometimes when you're super focused on it, you can get kind of flustered and forget what you're doing, or forget which order you're doing, so that can kind of help you to just stay on track and remember which order you're going in without having to like flip back and forth and figure that out. Another thing is that, especially if you're starting in the middle, if you're not starting with the first one, if you're kind of like skipping around, just make sure that the answers that you're bubbling in match up with the question number. So if you're starting with passage number 2, that starts with question number 11. So don't try to fill those in for the 1 through 10 spots, because then you're gonna get all messed up for the rest of them.
How are you gonna get messed up if it goes like A, B, C, D, F, G, H, J?
What do you mean?
Like how like the every other question has like different answer choices. So it's gonna be like really hard to mess up.
Well-
50-50 chance of messing up.
Well, number 1 and number 11, like the first ones of each, like they match up. So like number 1 is A through D, number 11 is A through D. You see what I'm saying?
No.
So if I'm starting with passage number 2 and I'm bubbling in those answers, what I'm saying is you're answering question number 11. So don't try to bubble that in for question number 1 answer slot, if you haven't already done those.
Okay.
So if you're starting in the middle, let's see, there should be like a bubble sheet on here that I can show you what I mean. Somewhere in here, I think. Maybe a different book there is.
Can you like fill in like just half the bubble? Like when you do the bubble, can you like fill like just part of it in, or do the entire bubble? Can I just like entire bubble?
I
It
think
takes
you
so
have
much
to do
time.
the entire bubble just because it's a computer
Oh.
that does it. Okay,
Cause like
so,
at school, I used to do like a little dot in my bubble and it still counts. You have to do the whole thing.
yeah, I think you have to do the whole thing.
It takes so much time to fill in the bubble. I'm like, oh my gosh.
I
it's
mean,
like a
I've
whole
never
minute
tested
to
it,
fill in
but
one bubble.
You'd rather be
Bubbles are, like,
safe
that
than
big.
sorry, rather fill it in
You
all the
wanna
way than not getting credit for any of them.
Look,
Yeah, but
that counts.
Okay,
Other
so
than
what
that,
I'm
it's
saying
like
is, I'm working on the reading test right here.
Two.
I'm doing this passage first, so I have not answered any of the rest of these questions. So I need to bubble in question number 11 and not question
Oh.
number 1.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's gonna throw everything off. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Because then you won't realize it until you go to start that first one.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh shoot, I messed this up.
Well, why don't you just do a whole passage then bubble everything in?
I
Or, like the
mean,
whole test.
you could do that, but I would just, especially if you're working up until the last minute, I would just be careful of that so that you don't run out of time and you don't fill in your bubbles all the way. You don't get to fill in all of them. If you find that you're getting done early enough with the test, that you have enough time to fill in all the bubbles and you're not gonna be worried about that, go for it. But if you find, or if you're worried that you're not gonna finish the test, I would not wait until the end to fill in all of your bubbles, because then what happens if you have let's say you have 1 minute left. Now you have to bubble in all these answers, well then you only get through half of them. Well, maybe you answered all the questions, they're in your booklet, but you only got to bubble in half of them, so you're only going to get credit for answering the ones that you actually answered.
Yes, but like if like there's like a passage left and you, or a passage left and you have 1 minute, kind of know that you're not gonna do well, and like either way.
I mean, you still gotta bubble in the answers, otherwise you're not gonna get any credit at all. At least you
Well,
have a 1/4 shot, 25% chance of getting it right, even if you just guess, rather than getting a 0% chance of getting it right if you don't fill it in at all.
Okay.
But again, if you find that you're getting done early enough with the test, and you're not worried about not having enough time to fill in your bubbles, then you can do that. But if you are finding that you're going up until the last minute, I would not recommend filling them all in at the very end.
I'm sorry, you guys are arguing about filling in bubbles?
Yes, you are correct.
Just wanted to make sure.
Wait, what was your order again for your like? You
Arguing
do
about
prose
bubbles.
fiction first? Is that what you did?
I did humanities first. I think I should probably.
Wait, so humanities, what is that again? That's just like more.
It's like music.
Yeah, it could be photography, music, it could be art,
Okay.
things like that.
Okay.
Prose fiction is really any type of story or narrative. It's gonna be in first person,
Okay.
Um,
And then natural science is what?
like biology, things like that.
I hate biology. I'll do that one last.
And then social science is just social studies.
Like history.
Yeah, it could be history, could be government, typically things like that. One thing I noticed when we were doing practice passages in the other class was with prose fiction, I'm not sure if this is like always the case, but a lot of times practice passages with prose fiction have something to do with transportation.
Hmm?
Like, there was, like, it's, for some reason, it comes up a lot, like the passage has something to do with transportation, so like maybe it's set on a train, or it's on a bus, or a plane, or something like that, so that's something that comes up a lot. Not always gonna be the case, but yes.
I've only seen that once, and that was passage 1 of this.
Of this one,
Yes.
have you done all the passages in this book?
Yes.
Well, then
Like
maybe,
twice.
maybe in this book, it's not, but in the red book that the other class has,
I've done that too.
there was quite a few. I think it was the purple one, maybe.
I've done that also.
Yeah. Again, it's not like every single time it's going to be about transportation, but that does come up pretty frequently, at least in the practice passages that I've done. So, just something to be aware of. Are there any other questions or concerns about the test? How many weeks away are we? Like what? 3 weeks? 4 weeks? Yeah, that seems right. Do you guys feel prepared for it? Feel pretty good?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. In all sections or just certain ones? Feel good overall? Like you feel like you got this?
Yeah.
Your score is gonna go up, you're gonna do amazing, you're gonna get a perfect 36?
No.
I have
I don't know
to
about a perfect 36.
I have
I'd
to
be like
be
an
very
18 and
unconfident.
a half.
In,
Have you ever
all of
taken
them?
it? No.
oh, you've never taken the ACT
No, I
before?
have not. So I
Okay,
just feel unconfident with myself.
well, go in feeling confident, and then maybe that positive mindset
You have nothing
will
to lose.
translate.
Nothing, yeah, okay, it's true.
You're never gonna lose points.
Just my entire life is determined by one test, but I mean, it's fine.
That's just kind of the way.
That's
It
only-
works.
Wow, one test determines everything.
How many, how old are you? Like, what grade are you in?
17, junior.
You're a junior. Okay. So you have a few, you can take it a few more times.
Yeah, I'll take it like 3 or 4 probably, just to get it, I don't know. I'm
Or
hoping bad
maybe
the first time.
this time, the first time you take it, you're just gonna be so well prepared that you do so well that you don't have to take it
I
again.
hope, oh my gosh, that'd be, I don't know, I don't think that's gonna happen, but we'll see.
Did any of you take the October ACT?
Yeah,
How did that go?
it was easy.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. I thought it was the easiest one I've taken so far.
How many have you taken?
It was my third one.
Your third one. Okay. Alright, well, let's see. We don't have enough time to do a passage because you guys asked a lot of questions.
I
Which,
did a passage.
what?
I did passage 1 when you were explaining because I thought you would make us do it.
Well, now you're just gonna be ahead. There's nothing wrong with that. So, if you guys have any concerns that you'd like to address, feel free to come ask me about it.